Thank you and good morning and welcome to this APPG on social integration's fifth and final evidence gathering session. The APPG on social integration is a group of parliamentarians that aim to drive forward a cross-party conversation on policy solutions that break down barriers to integration and create opportunities for people from all walks of life to connect with each other and build bonds of trust. The Covid-19 crisis has highlighted the importance of social connection for our own well-being and for society as a whole. There has been an outpouring of neighbourliness and an increase in the numbers of volunteers coming forward to offer their time. Civil society, faith groups, councils and businesses have worked hard to reach the most vulnerable. If asked, many of us would agree that this crisis has brought us closer together. But the crisis has also brought challenges for social relations, highlighted in an initial report that this APG published in May 2020, written during the first national lockdown. The report set out the issues that the COVID-19 crisis raised for social connection and integration, sharing some of the innovative practice that had sought to address these challenges. As we move into the next phase of this pandemic, it is important that there is space for reflection to consider the lessons and learning from the crisis in respect of social connection and integration. It is in this context that the APPG on social integration will now hold a second inquiry focusing on the legacy and lessons of the COVID-19 crisis in relation to social connection and integration. And this is our fifth and, as I say, final evidence gathering session. So fundamentally, the key question for us is, what action is needed to build stronger community relations as we emerge from the pandemic? I will be inviting our witnesses to introduce themselves with a short opening remark for up to 3 minutes about themselves and the organisations that they represent, and then I will move on to my questions. So in no particular order, please can I start with Julie?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for doing this and for having me here. So I've worked in grassroots community organising for more than 20 years now, mainly focusing, I guess, on relationships between different faiths, and focusing specifically on social action in Muslim communities. I set up Siddiqi Day 6 years ago, which was a day of social action to encourage Muslims to see charity beyond just giving money, but actually volunteering and social action. And that's seen hundreds of volunteers all over the country over these last 6 years. I also co-founded the Big Iftar 9 years ago, which was again looking at trying to encourage Muslims to open up Ramadan more, to look at opening up to other communities. And one of the amazing outcomes of that has been not just hundreds of iftars, breaking of the fast meals with different communities, but also Muslims being hosted in synagogues, cathedrals, schools, and all sorts of other amazing places in a way that I never ever could have imagined, which has been amazing. I'm also co-founder of Nisa Nashim, which is the largest Jewish and Muslim women's network in Europe. We have Jewish and Muslim women co-chairing groups all over the UK, and that's been very successful, working between those two communities and bringing us together through women. I'm also co-founder of Open My Mosque, which is a campaigning and advocacy group of Muslim women, really challenging the status quo, inequalities, and discrimination within Muslim communities. I'm very passionate about my faith. I'm also very much aware that the inequalities and things that are not going okay need to be called out as well. For example, 1/3 of mosques don't have a space for women to pray in the UK. That kind of thing is not okay for me. And so I'm very happy where I need to be able to call out those things. And last but not least, my most recent social enterprise community interest company is called Together We Thrive. And it's really focusing in on Muslim women and women of other faith communities working together, mentoring, training, empowerment, community organizing. And I'm absolutely loving that. I'm on the National Steering Committee for the Together Coalition, chaired by the Archbishop of Canterbury. I live in Slough. I'm a governor at 2 local schools here. And in the last 18 months to 2 years or so, and particularly in the last year, I've re-engaged back in locally where I live to really try and see what I can bring back into my local town. That's my 49 years of life in 3 minutes.
Thank you, Julie. You're clearly a very busy lady. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your evidence. You're clearly going to have a lot to say, so I welcome that. Can we move on to Kaneez, please?
Hi, everybody. I'm Kaneez Khan. I am the West Yorkshire coordinator for an organisation called Neighbours, my local organisation that manages me, and also where I deliver my work from is called Wales Brings Together. And my role is, at this moment in time, is to bring people together. Historically, again, like Julie, I have done 20 years, over 2 decades of community social action in the community where I live, and that has been mainly focused on it. It wasn't focused on faith and interfaith at that time, even though we did some aspect of that faith, but it was it was more about the crime, social deprivation, attainment of children in education. So I've been a governor, I've been a NED, I've been a trustee I've also led women's groups, led girls, youth clubs, and so many other things before I came into this role. Since I've come into this role, I've expanded my horizons and gone regional and national, and it's been a eye-opening journey. Some of it has been really, really, really positive. So the brilliant thing of how people have come together during not just COVID, but come together generally to try to build bridges and have positive relationships with it, but also some of the not so positive side of the difficulty, the challenges around misogyny, around strongly held belief within some faiths, and not one particular faiths as in more than one faith, and trying to get around those hurdles, to have those communications and to make changes within grassroots organizations. And what's been really positive is that I've helped shape some of the COVID strategy with the government, where it's come to test and trace and vaccination, and that's been a really positive thing that I've done during this year as well. And coming here and trying to give some evidence around the work that we've done on COVID within our areas and within the work of Neighbours is a great opportunity. So that's it, I think, from me. One more thing as well. I'm a single mum of 4 children, and that's that's the most important part of my life, actually. Everything else is behind, but yeah, I've got 4 children by myself for 14 years.
Thank you, Kaneez, and I look forward to receiving your evidence as well. You're clearly also very busy as well, certainly with the children anyway. Lazzaro, can I move to you, please?
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Lazzaro Pietragnoli. I am the communication manager for Near Neighbours. Near Neighbours is the same organization that Kaneez is part of, and is a national charity bringing people together in communities that are religiously and ethnically diverse in order to build relationship of trust and help groups to work together across differences. On a personal level, I was born in Italy. I grew up in Venice, and since my university years, I've always been interested and involved in interfaith and multicultural activities. And I'm a father of 2, and I'm very busy on another personal level. I'm also a local councillor in what I can say my spare time, though I don't have much spare time.
Thank you, Lazzaro. And I can see that Qari has joined us. Qari, would you just like to introduce yourself very briefly?
Sure, thank you. So I'm Qari Asim. I am based in Leeds. I'm Imam in one of the mosques in Leeds Makkah mosque. I'm also chair of Mosques and Imams National Advisory Board. It's a bit mouthful, but it's basically dealing with mosques and imams across the country. And by profession, I'm a lawyer dealing with commercial property.
Thank you,
Qari. To this session.
I appreciate you joining us. Thank you. So moving on to my very first question, how has the pandemic affected community relations between different ethnic and faith groups? If I can go in the same order that we did the introduction. So Julie, please.
Yeah, so I think I would say the first word that comes to mind is positive. I think the way that people have stepped up in general has been amazing. I think the faith groups have been absolutely at the forefront of all of what we've seen over the past year. I think there was definitely a sense that we had to pull together. And I think that it's been really very, very humbling to see how different groups have done that. together, not just kind of by themselves, probably more perhaps than I've ever seen in all of my sort of community journey. I guess we have to be aware and always reminding ourselves of the fact that not every area is diverse in whatever way we mean diversity. And so not everybody will have experienced what perhaps I have, or those of us on this call that do live in diverse areas have experienced firsthand and seen it happen very much locally. And I would say that some of the faith groups have literally kept people alive in the last year or so, which has been really amazing. But I guess where people aren't living in diverse areas, that hasn't been the case. I would say, though, that I still feel, and this is what I think is important, that those people living in more areas that don't have so much diversity ethnically, faith-wise, etc., will have still seen through the reports and through the things that they will have seen on TV. I think the message has still got across to those people that very much people did pull together, and that the faith communities were absolutely part and parcel of what happened in the last year. I think, of course, there's also been a new, and I would say very positive, emphasis on the importance of key workers, and how many of those key workers are from all sorts of different backgrounds, and really show the kind of diversity of what I think is the beautiful thing about this country, especially in some of the cities where that is much more apparent. I think those people that needed help, they didn't really care where it came from, they just needed help. And I think that the speed in which people put things in place really, you know, is testimony to those faith groups that very much have it really as part of the DNA. Part of our DNA is that we have to help people. You don't stop and think about who they are or what they are, you just help. And in that case, I think the last year was brilliant. I think the kind of festivals and religious, all of the religious parts of the year for different communities were significant, were difficult, but I think were also, people were innovative and came up with new ways of doing things. And I think the other thing I wanted to flag really, which I think is important, is the way in which people have organized themselves online in ways, doing things that I've not seen before. And I think that will be something that's going to be very positive for us. And I would say from a Muslim woman's perspective, the level and the amount of innovation and brilliant organizing by Muslim women online has been awesome. And I think, again, has really sort of set a different bar, and has really meant that people don't need to wait for perhaps permission to use a space or to do things in communities, but absolutely are able to organize by themselves. It's always been the case, but of course, having more awareness of being able to use online spaces, I think, has really come into its own. And I think that is there to stay. And some of the conversations, the creative stuff that I've been part of, or that I've sat in on, or whatever, has really been brilliant. And I think that can only be a good thing as we go forward.
Thank you, Julie. Can I move on to Kaneez?
Can you just ask the question again, please?
Yes. So how has the pandemic affected community relations between different ethnic and faith groups?
So I'm going to firstly talk about the positive, because it was absolutely phenomenal, and has been all the way through from the start, from March last year. Again, faith and community sector leading the way, because I think when we actually went into lockdown, the bureaucracy around some of the statutory agency, they were not able to put their foot as fast on the ground as faith and communities were. Like when the food shelves were going empty in the supermarkets, and then the food banks weren't getting the food to give to the families that they've been always given to, that was faith and community that stepped up there. And then it was the small groups, it was the small faith centers as well as the big ones, so everyone came together to do that. And I don't suppose anybody imagined that would happen with the food situation. And there was just a scramble. I remember how such a scramble to get the food together, to get these to the food banks. And this was across the whole of our region, the whole of the country. And it's carried on. The isolation, the helping of the elderly, the shielding, everything, in every area, there was that support given, and the befriending services on the phone. they might not have belonged, so a lot of the volunteers might not have like belonged to the council volunteer service or to like the Royal Voluntary Service, but that didn't mean that they weren't volunteers on the ground from different faiths and ethnicities doing what was needed to keep the country going. But then some of the challenging situations that have risen from the pandemic, and I suppose it was a really disproportionate impact on the underrepresented groups across the country, the doctors dying, the people in 3-4 generational households, everyone getting impacted by COVID and long COVID, as well as the disproportionate amount of deaths. And I suppose that was like a more affirming thing for a lot of the ethnic minorities, but also a will from some of the statutory agencies to say, do you know what, we want things to be different. My concern around that is it going to last? I hope that it does last. But another thing that was really that caused division, and it caused quite a lot of division, was when the Eid lockdown was announced 2.5 hours before Eid on Thursday night in the northern region, in some of the cities like Bradford. And I do believe, because we've had the meetings with the ministers, I do believe there's a lot of regret on the side of the government for making that announcement at that late stage. But that automatically pointed the finger at Muslims and for spreading COVID in areas like Bradford that are already high in deprivation and already challenged. So there was a lot. So when these COVID mutual groups that were on Facebook and everything else, so lots and lots of, which would be previously, before that, there was all helpful messages going on within that, in those mutual aid groups, actually turned into quite a toxic environment that some people didn't want to stay on the groups because of how the blame factor on those social media. We did as much as we could to change that, but I think the damage was done, and in hindsight the government wouldn't have done it, but it still left us to pick up the key pieces afterwards, working on Eid Day. And so I think that these things are really important, the disproportionate impact on Black minority ethnic communities and the timing of these lockdowns. So I think that's my bit for this part.
Thank you, Kaneez. I just wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the timing of that lockdown and coinciding with Eid. If you could just say a little bit more about that in terms of what you think should have happened as opposed to what did happen.
If the announcement had been made a week or two before, at least 2 weeks before, that was a different story. If they had allowed Eid to happen and then actually put the lockdown on Monday, Tuesday, that would have been brilliant too. Whichever way they could have done it, a few days wouldn't have made no difference. People had come across, like for example, one of the people that were at the meeting with the ministers, his sister had come across, so she woke up breaking the law. She hadn't realized that she was breaking the law when she went to sleep, and then when she woke up, she was breaking the law. So the police couldn't even manage it. How can police manage whole communities that are already have done their cooking, had made their plans, had done everything that they'd needed to do to prepare for Eid, and then to have it pulled back at the last minute and totally locked down, really did cause a lot of upset and grief and feeling scapegoated from the Muslim community in those areas. And they were they didn't stay quiet. People did speak there and then. They didn't stay quiet. And like the Council of Mosques in Bradford, they were working till 2 o'clock in the morning that night, and I was working till late. I worked on all day on Eid from 9:30 to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That's my Eid day. I've been fasting all month. I mean, it was in August. It wasn't the fasting, but it was our Eid. It was our Eid, and it was our time to celebrate, but we were working. I was still on the phone at 2 o'clock trying to arrange the meetings that were going to happen on Monday. And these things couldn't wait. And there wasn't just me, there were so many people like me, and the upset and how families felt not being able to celebrate together at that time. And not that there would have been loads of togetherness anyway, but just the small amount that they could have done, that was just ripped away at the last minute.
Okay. Thank you, Kaneez. Lazzaro, can I move on to you with regards to the first question about
Yes.
how the pandemic's affected community relations between different ethnic and faith groups?
I'll start from the Ramadan and the mention that Kaneez did about the lockdown during a religious festival. And thinking about the first lockdown happened just before Ramadan, before Passover, and before Easter. So essentially the three major religious festivals were all affected. And I think this brought some sense of solidarity and understanding between different religions and different faith groups. And they were all in the similar situation to find new ways of celebrating their religious festival in a different way. So I think that paradoxically was a positive result of the lockdown. And we have seen lots of different faith groups and communities working together to support each other. Just an example, in Luton, the Sikh Gurdwara organized food deliveries for the Muslim community during Ramadan, despite the historical differences and difficulties that there are between those communities. They were able to overcome those difficulties and try to help each other. And we have seen lots of those examples. Of course, there were also some mistrust and some difficulties with finger pointing and blaming other communities for not respecting the rules or other groups for not respecting the rules, and some, especially at the beginning of the lockdown, some act of racism against Chinese and Eastern people because seen as the cause of the virus. That we don't have to undermine those. But overall, I agree with Julie and Kaneez that the response was overwhelming positive and bringing people from different faiths and groups together. A final point linking to what Julie was saying about the use of social media and new media and new technologies. I think that I'll bring a personal experience. I do, as part of my job, I do training on how to use social media, and I was meant to do one of those training at the beginning of the lockdown for a group of women, only women group. And it was a bit difficult if I was meant to do it in person, because they would not allow me to be part of the group. And instead, because the training was delivered over Zoom, they allow me to be there and to share with them my experience. And so in a sense, working with social distance also brings down some of the barriers that may happen in physical, if instead physical contact and physical presence was involved. But at the same time, we have also experienced the difficulties of some of the groups, especially the small one and the more informal group, to adapt to this new way of working. So that is another element that we need to take into account, that possibly has made more difficult for some of the people to be involved and to feel integrated in a new way of working.
Thank you, Lazzaro. Can I move to you, Qari? Do you have anything to say in respect of that point?
Sure. I'll echo what the three other participants have already contributed to. I think I'll just like to mention three examples. Firstly, the positives, the food bank working together has been extremely inspiring. So as a faith leader, for me, it was deeply moving to see young Muslims whilst fasting in the month of Ramadan, queuing up outside supermarkets to buy food for those who were in isolation in their neighborhood, those who, the elderly who could not go shopping, and that really brought communities together. And examples ranging from people coming together, people of different age, different ethnicity coming together with social distancing, clapping for the NHS and helping the frontline workers. So lots of examples to do with the food. Secondly, I think I'm going to give a few examples from the faith network. One key example is the cremation issue that arose during the first lockdown. There was debate in the Parliament about potentially cremation being on the card and laws being passed around that. And faith communities, faith leadership in particular, work with the political leadership, and there were lots of conversations, calls all the way with the chief rabbi to the archbishop to local faith leaders to see how it could be averted and people's religious freedoms could be protected. And eventually, the Parliament listened, the government worked with faith leadership to make sure that cremation wasn't on the cards where it was not religiously possible. So that was a fantastic example in terms of communities working together. Thirdly, places of worship. It was excruciatingly painful as faith communities to close the doors of our mosques and places of worship, but communities rallied together, and I think we took inspiration from each other. What was, I guess, so difficult was around the time of the second lockdown in November, where certain faith communities were able to perform religious worship in their places of worship because individual prayers were allowed, but other communities were not able to perform how they usually perform their prayer. And then I guess the key difference was that if 3 people went to a place of worship and individually prayed, that was absolutely legal. But if the same 3 people with social distancing synchronized their movement, that was illegal. And so that really required a lot of convincing, a lot of understanding on the part of communities. To be fair to the government, I think in the third lockdown, at the time, places of worship have been open, and that's been extremely welcomed, albeit making sure that all places of worship follow the guidelines and risk assessment. And I guess one key negative aspect is how some of the members of the far right kept spreading rumors and fake news about Muslims. In particular during the first lockdown, historic footage were in circulation on social media to say, look, Muslims are not following the rules, and that created a negative vibe within communities. But what's been incredibly inspiring is not only the faith communities, but people of all backgrounds rallied together and came closer to each other during the pandemic. And that's been one key positive aspect of this pandemic. And I hope that long continues post COVID-19.
Thank you, Qari.
Thank you.
Without seeking to concentrate on the negative, because it's really important that we record the positives out of this, and that's what we're really trying to uncover. Can I ask you as well if, and I think you've touched on it already, particularly around social media, etc., about emerging tensions and divisions between communities as a result of the pandemic. And I wonder if you could each comment in respect of that, about whether you see new tensions emerging, and if so, what needs to happen in terms of policy to tackle that. So if I can come to Julie to start with, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Qari mentioned about social media, or others did as well. And I think it's always difficult to disentangle what is happening on social media, and is that really what people are feeling on the ground? And often, of course, it isn't. There is often a disconnect between the two. Things are much better in reality than they might seem online. The problem, of course, with that is it means that it can be whipped up. So I definitely think there was a phase where there was a sense that certain groups, and in some of that was about Muslims or people from Asian background, meeting and gathering. But I think that on the whole, because over time other groups also got blamed, so students, young people, etc., etc. So I think that it was happening, and of course we've just heard examples already, but I think that overwhelmingly what I have seen has been more positive than negative. And that's not me not wanting to talk about the negative stuff, but just trying to be realistic. And I think that the other thing I have found really positive, and hopefully will continue, the relationship between faith communities and government, I think was very positive in terms of opening places of worship and sort of trying to, you know, conduct discussions specific to each group, because of course they're all very different, but also then trying to link them in and how can different groups support each other. So for me, I think that there have been points of tension, but I would say it's overwhelmingly been responded to by the stuff that people have actually experienced. And you can't argue with the facts of how many key workers are from different backgrounds. You know, you can certainly try, but the facts speak for themselves. And so I think those kinds of arguments and discussions within families and even online, but online is always going to be toxic, I think it's very difficult for racist people to argue and back it up with anything, because really the facts, the pictures, the experiences, the stories, they really do speak for themselves, I think.
Thank you. Kaneez, can I move to you? You're muted, Kaneez.
Can you ask me the question again, please?
Yeah, sure. So I'm talking about tensions and divisions that have emerged during the pandemic between communities. So we've already talked about how communities have come together. So if you can comment on what you perceive as being new divisions that are emerging between communities, and what, if anything, can be done to break down those barriers again.
I think from some of the Eastern European communities, there's been a real concern, because on the census that was in however many years ago that it was, they've been classed, I think, as white other. And because of that, they haven't got they feel as if, even though there will be something, so this is what these are their discussions with us, even though there will be something that can record ethnicity or country of birth or whatever religion that they are, there will be some way of tracking that. They feel as if they might not be fully in the statistics and what their losses might have been throughout this whole year, how many were disproportionately affected. So there's been some of that's been coming through, but the communities that we've been working with from Eastern Europe, honestly, their response has been amazing, absolutely amazing. With the community tensions, I think what has been really, I've already outlined a lot of the community tensions that happened, and were very tense time for us for a few months actually. But I think through all of that, what has come through for me is that government did listen. They did, and they listened, actively listened. They actively sent researchers. They actively had those difficult conversations. Even 2 weeks ago, I had a meeting where they said, just give us a reality check. We want to hear it. My fear about that is that when the pandemic is over, I hope that type of engagement doesn't just fall on the wayside, because they've done a lot of work to try to build those bridges. But I think where the disconnect has then come has been from national and local, so the statutory, where what were the guidelines around vaccination centres and testing centres, and what was that communication between those two, and how did that work? Because the hesitation around test and trace and vaccination is still very, especially, well, actually both of them, very serious in some of our areas that we're working in. And even we received an email last night, a very difficult email from a group talking about the alcohol, talking about the fetus and the fact that it's actually in the vaccines. And so all these things, we're trying to challenge some of that on the ground, but where are the vaccination centres based? Are they actually at that hyper local level? Because if they're not at that hyper local level and they're not at people, so the most important message from us to the government has been, we need centres like the vaccination centres and the testing centres in places where the messenger is trusted, and the messenger that's going to come along with it. So it's not just the building, it's got to be so Imam, Qari is in Imam in Leeds. I'm from Leeds, so I would trust Qari. I've been to his mosque, I've read prayers there, and I know that of his reputation. And so if Qari is going to say to me there's no alcohol and there's no fetus in there, I'll totally believe him. But if it's not him passing the message, I might not believe it. I might believe what's online. So there is still a big gap right now, and it's an immediate and urgent one. It's not something that we can put off till later on. But I'm going to acknowledge openly, and the engagement from government has been really good around, really, really positive around all of this. But there is a disconnect between local and national.
Thank you, Kaneez. Can I come to you, Qari? I believe you have actually recorded some videos encouraging the Muslim community to get their vaccinations done, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I've shared some of them actually.
All right. Okay, great. Thank you for that. Excellent. I think some are obviously legitimate concerns whether it's safe or not to use a vaccine, and also whether there are, from religious perspective, any impermissible substances. So those were legitimate concerns, and we were very pleased to deal with them. Then we come on to the second issue about the basically anti-vaxxer movement spreading fake news, and they range from the side effects to impact on fertility to lack of trust in public institutions. And I think so some of those issues are intergenerational and easy to deal with. So for instance, side effects, that really required more awareness, and as Kaneez was saying, trusted voices have been really important in all of this. I think the messenger is as important as the message in all of this, to deal with this pandemic. And the misinformation obviously can cost lives in this pandemic, and that's why the faith leadership has really been key in all of this. And I think the government's announcement and the launch of the community champions have been, has been a really positive thing. I think the only critique would be that perhaps it's something that we could have thought about early on and could have launched it before the anti-vaxxer movement took deep root in communities. The key issue is, I guess, the lack of trust between the public institutions and the grassroots, and which can't be turned overnight. But perhaps there's a good learning in all of this for us to see that how we can carry that kind of relationship of having community champions and using them as conduits between the government and the grassroots, because obviously no one is hesitant to protect their lives or lives of others. So the lack of confidence in the vaccine arises from different issues. So that's all I wanted to say on the vaccine. I think in terms of the community tensions, I would just like to highlight two issues. One was, if we take the example of Leicester, where there are different communities that predominantly from Pakistani background and the Indian background. And as a result, what was happening in India in terms of some of the news that was coming, the Muslims are spreading COVID in India by having large gatherings, again, partly fake news, but partly there may have been some element of truth in that. That was filtering in communities here, and as a result, tension was being created between communities, and so there tends to be a direct impact, and the tensions arise because of that. Another example would be, I guess, obviously the sad murder or death of George Floyd in the US led to Black Lives Movement having protests, and so although people sympathized with what was happening, but when they saw some protests and they were not able to perhaps go and see their mom, or perhaps go and see their loved ones, again, there was issue that how can one community can carry on what they're doing, whereas we have to follow the rules. So tension, pockets of tensions arose temporarily, when some of these real issues arose. But thankfully, I think the leadership, the political as well as community leadership, dealt with those issues very well.
Thank you, Qari. Lazzaro?
Yeah, I follow up on what Qari was saying, because there are two elements, one on the vaccination and the other one on Black Lives Matters, that I want to echo and reinforce. The first one, indeed, the community champion is a fantastic project, and possibly starting before would have been better than starting at the end of the second lockdown. And my understanding is that this program is working better because it's local based and is built on the knowledge and the roots that local people have in their communities. So the same message is more effective if it's given to someone who is embedded in the local community rather than from a national institution, because as Qari was saying, there is some historical mistrust in communities towards the national institution, the national government. And so involving the local communities, involving the local authorities is always easier, more direct. And also it allows a more two-way confrontation, because most of the work that we're doing with the community champion is also listening and reporting to the authorities. So there is a listening part that should be embedded in what the government is doing. On the tension between communities, I don't know if there has been any new tension. Possibly there have been new manifestations of old tensions, new variants, I would say, to use a word which is quite popular at the moment. And there are indeed elements of social inequalities, economic inequalities. But I wanted to stress what Qari was saying. Though it was sparked by events in the US, the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, and all the discussion about the legacy of the empire and the role of Black people and minority people in this country, I think he has highlighted the need of working to build a fundamental role of leadership for the ethnic minorities and give them more role in leading the community. It's a long, I don't have a single project or a single idea, but definitely we need to understand that they're not minority any longer. They're part of this culture, of this world, and we need to build a leadership for those people in the society.
Lazzaro, that's a really important point, and thank you for raising it, because I think that leads me very, very nicely on to my next question in respect of all of the positive changes that we've seen during COVID-19, improvements in social connection, improvements in community action. How do we sustain that for the future? And what is required from government or from local authorities to achieve that? So as we've just moved from Lazzaro, can I come straight back to you, Lazzaro, because I think that builds nicely on the point that you've just raised.
I think some of the things that have been tried during the pandemic should be implemented and remain in place. I think about the involvement of.
Can you give me some examples?
Yes, I was going to some examples, sorry. The involvement of local community groups, faith groups, and local people, local activists, with the CCG and the NHS in order to develop. I have some example in Ealing or in West London, where they brought together, or in Birmingham, they set up informal forum to discuss how to address the emergency, the pandemic, how to address the vaccination rollout. And I think it's important to maintain these forums, to give these forums a real role in organizing and developing the services, because that opportunity was not given before to many of those faith groups. And we realize, yes, they're very important in the moment of emergency, but when the emergency is no longer there, we need to maintain and to sustain that. And they are important because they are a moment when the local institution, but also the national institution, can listen to people. I think the listening exercise is something that is lacking a bit in the system. It's more you know, we do surveys, we do these sort of things, but giving people the opportunity to bring their own experience and use their own experience and their own concerns and in order to develop how to bring forward some policies is very, very important.
Thank you, Lazzaro. Julie, can I come to you? Can you give me some examples of how we sustain this positive change for the future? And have you got a message for government, local government, about how to sustain that?
Yeah, I mean, I also wanted to pick up the word leader. I mean, even faith leader and community leader. And I think that what we've seen in the last year is a very good reminder of why we all, central government, local government, need to really rethink about who they consider to be a leader and what is a community leader or a faith leader, and really be much more open and I guess diverse about that. And I would, of course, in my the passion I have for gender equality, of course, a lot of this, you know, a lot of what we've seen has meant that people have realized that everybody can have a role to play, you know, and younger people need to be involved. And if you think about leadership, I would say Marcus Rashford actually was an unexpected but very effective communicator and actually leader in terms of how he galvanized people to really step up, and also, of course, you know, had the ear of government. And why was he effective? He was effective for a number of reasons, but one of the main ones I would say is because he was genuine and authentic. He had experience of it from his own childhood, and he brought that absolutely into what he was saying, and people, you know, it really resonated. And I saw, even at a local level, how his voice and his work really mobilized people who never would have otherwise thought to be involved in half term. Are the kids okay? Can we help in any way? You know, I even saw examples locally here where people were so moved to want to help some of the families that were struggling that people collected goods and food but didn't even know how to get to the families. It was almost like the other way around for what I think is sometimes needed. But it was just people really being motivated by someone I think, you know, absolutely was a leader in that moment. And I think it's a really important thing for us to remember, that you need people, as has been mentioned already, that are authentic, that are actually in the communities, on the ground, locally, doing their thing. Now, I was involved in the local mutual aid. I actually set up the local mutual aid group here in Slough with one other person. And then we connected with the others that were around the country. And I think that the very super local community organizing, that kind of very old-fashioned community organizing that we kind of all used to have to do because we didn't have internet and things like that, where people actually connected with literally with the other people in their street and organize things. I don't think you can really get any better than that in terms of actually being effective at making change on the ground. Of course, what I think government and local government need to do are to support people like that to be able to sustain it and continue. I don't even think these things need lots of money, but I do think it needs investment and focus in order to create a scenario where people emerge as leaders and are supported to then, you know, manage things in their local area. And I would say, yeah.
Can I just turn that back to you? And,
yeah.
and you say some really important things there. It's not about money, but it's about investment.
Yeah.
But if this is the community coming together, if this is people on a street or in a road who are, you know, taking care of each other and effectively the real community coming together, what role is there for government to tell people to do that?
Yeah, I don't think it's so much telling. I think that, I mean, let's also say that when we talk about inequalities, some areas were better at this than others. Some will talk about, you know, effective community WhatsApp groups. And of course, some, you know, cul-de-sacs in a rural village somewhere may have been able to do that easily. And in some places that was much more difficult. I think what I saw even locally, and I heard lots of other people from mutual aid groups around the country, I saw, you know, different responses from local authorities. Some local authorities absolutely understood the point that Kaneez mentioned earlier, and I absolutely feel it too. is that you don't need to tell people what to do, but you need to, enable it to kind of happen, and it will emerge from the ground upwards. What I saw, which I found fascinating, but actually sometimes quite frustrating as well, there's a difference when a local authority or a local council for voluntary service decide that they are the people that are in charge and everything has to come through them. If we had all waited for the local authorities and the machinery to kick into place, nothing would have happened for the first couple of weeks of that first lockdown. I saw communities, individuals, people stepping in and filling a gap that otherwise the local authority were not able to do. What you then need to do is empower and enable those people and support them and, back them. You don't need to control them and say, right, we're in charge here and you guys can just do the work, but actually, recognize what different communities, particularly I would say ethnic and faith communities, what they actually bring to the table is very different to what a sort of standard statutory body could ever do. And so that needs to be properly acknowledged and recognized and then enabled to happen. So it's not about telling people what to do, it's about recognizing how good it is. And I saw different examples of that, some really poor examples of over dominance of local authority kind of, wanting to control things, and others where local groups of just people, so the sort of people power in some places was brilliantly engaged with and, responded to and celebrated. And other places it was sort of made to feel that that wasn't really the way to go. So I think there's definitely something about that. I think things around what I saw again firsthand and what I think is really powerful can be really good partnerships that are maybe not as strong as they could be, but can be so effective when it comes to things like, for example, schools, community groups, businesses, those kind of partnerships that sometimes are weaker than I think they need to be, can be so effective, because schools are, a brilliant place to engage families and to really make those connections. And I was able to do that through having connections with some of the schools here, and then really get to the families. They know the families really well. And if you're wanting to help, and how do you connect up and make those things better, I think making those connections between some of those groups are good. And if you think about something like social prescribing, some people like the name, some people don't. The concept I think is brilliant, which is much more about, don't think about medicating everything. How do we again link the community kind of together to help people? And if you think about the mental health challenges that we are already seeing, and I think are going to become even more apparent over the next few months, to a point where it's really quite concerning, how are we all going to kind of put arms around people who really need that support, and to sort of join some of those dots up, I think better in local areas would, I think, do some of that. And just reiterating the point about the inequalities in terms of different communities, we're talking about, of course, some places where people still do feel that they're not being heard and that their needs are not being met. And that if we don't listen to those voices, if we don't listen to white working class communities in estates up and down the country, as just one example, if we don't listen to that, if we don't help those people to feel empowered and to have a voice, then that is, never going to work, because of course those people rightly feel left out and left behind. And I know that there will be places in certain areas where more of an affluent community might be doing all this great community organizing. Just across the road is an estate, and never the two mix, even through this pandemic. There's definitely that kind of still socio-economic divide that I think we need to be very, very aware of. So I think the kind of, while I feel very positive about a lot of what I have seen, I know that there are groups of people or areas of the country where perhaps it's not quite as good as we might think, and we need to really think about how we connect it. And just to finish off, one thing that I found so inspiring, and I think can be really seen as a model, that the mutual aid model, some find difficult, because of course some people that are involved in that kind of movement are quite anti-establishment, if for want of a better way of saying it. And I found that personally very interesting, because I'm not like that. So I found that mixing with some of that very interesting and eye-opening for me. But there's absolutely no doubt that one of the most brilliant things about that movement and the way the local coordinators then came together is where I think we can learn something and think about how do we do that better. If we're talking about having community champions, as has been mentioned, or community organisers in, say, you know, a rural village in Cornwall, and you've got a community champion and organizer in Bradford working with someone like Kaneez, how do we, you know, make networks of those people end up being part of the same thing? That way, then, if you're in an area which isn't ethnically diverse, for example, you will still be in contact and looking at and working with and pulling together with someone who is actually from a very different community to you. And I think now with technology, with Facebook groups, with WhatsApp groups, I think this is all very, very possible if we just give it a bit of thought and not just think it's going to happen by itself, because it won't, but actually try and, in a way, you know, be an architect of how we connect those people together from different parts of the country.
Julie, you've said some really incredible things that have truly resonated with me and things that have happened and done in my community. And you talked about enabling, empowering, support and backing, and not being controlled. And I loved all of that. You also then went on to talk about, rather than there being a faith divide, an ethnic divide, religious divide, there being a socio-economic divide. And I understand what you say. The community that I represent has very distinct socio-economic parts to it. What do you think government or local government can do in terms of the report that we're going to produce here as a result of this session that can break down that socio-economic barrier, so the white working class from the problem estate end up working with and talking with our Sikh, Hindu, Asian minority communities in another part of town? How do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to accept that unless we manufacture and create opportunities for those groups of people to mix, it just isn't going to happen by itself. And I think it's always going to come down to finding local people. So if we take the white working class estate example that you and I have both already mentioned, and it sounds a bit crude even to say it, but there are, you know, that is one way of
it's a useful shorthand.
Yeah. I think that, you know, it's about finding the actors, the players, the people in those areas who are respected and who are well known. You know, every community has the enablers and the organizers and the leaders, the people who just do step in and step up and do things. And I saw some of those people emerge. I also saw people wanting to volunteer, but really having no idea what that even means or how to do it. And they then rely on the enabler and the organizer who does know how to do it and gives them something specific to do. Can you go and make cakes for the staff at the hospital? Yes, okay. They will go make the cakes. Someone like me will go and pick it up from 10 different houses and drop it off at the contact that I have at the hospital. You know, you need people that know how to do things. And I would argue that every community has those people, but they're just not always heard or supported. And I think bring some of those community enablers and organizers from the white working class estates, put them together in a room, have the conversation, see them as leaders with others from different communities, and how can we bring those things together. So for example, one thing that comes to mind straight away would be you have a group of, or an estate where the kids are just not doing well at school. And we know there are a whole load of reasons why that might be happening. But you might also have up the road a community, for example, in our case, I could say a mosque or a community centre where people have put a lot of effort into their own education, are now professional, are doing well in all sorts of different ways. And you can straight away see why those professionals need to be matched up with some of the young people who are not doing so well from whatever background. How can we get tuition going? How can we get after school clubs being run by some of those people? You know, I always think that if you go into a community with a whole load of professional volunteers who are willing to help you, for example, do better in your exams, you're not really going to care where those people come from, but the interaction and the kind of trust and the relationships that will be built up through those interactions will do their thing in their own way. You're not going to ever say anything bad about the person who helped you do better at school or get your apprenticeship or, you know, get trained up in a certain way. So I think that kind of stuff doesn't happen by accident. People are very willing. I always say, you know, if we had a setup where imams stood up on a Friday in the mosque and said, right, how many people here would want to help with XYZ ABC homework club next week? Loads of people would put their hand up. The problem is the kind of enabling and organizing of that, and the imam being aware of any of that stuff just isn't happening at the moment. But the people, the will, the wanting to help and connect with each other is most definitely there. I think you just need to think through a bit, how can we do it so that we're not just presuming it's going to happen by itself? Sorry, that's a very long answer.
No, it's a great answer, Julie. And I think at that point, that leads me nicely on to coming to Qari, I think. Challenge for you there on Friday prayers.
Now, look,
Julie, thank you for dropping me in.
He's a superstar imam. I mean, what can we say? You know, we need to clone him, but that's a whole other discussion for another day. We need to clone him somehow in a way that's halal and allowed and kosher.
Thank you both. Peter, I think firstly, I think there needs to be a real depth of strategic partnership between the state and community organizations, which is missing. And what we saw during the pandemic was people doing things of their own accord. And so there was, you know, statutory bodies doing things, faith sector, corporate organizations, education institutions. And as Julie was saying, what we need to do is somehow have enablers in place, investment, not necessarily investment in terms of funds, but actually in terms of time and energy to make this all happen. So Black, Asian, minority, ethnic communities may be rich in terms of the manpower, but not actually institutions. Whereas we have faith institutions that already know how to deliver things, how to convene things, and so it's collaboration between these and the financial investment coming in, potentially from the corporate organizations, because obviously now CR in a way the community pro bono work is part and parcel of many corporate organizations, but again, there's a disconnect in terms of how to do it, when to do it, what to do, and that all of that can be done. And local governments are usually good at this in terms of convening things. I think where things go wrong is that sometimes then when you convene after that, you also become the dominant factor that you want to control it and manage it, and that's unfortunately that's where things break down. And so a true strategic partnership is required. Now, coming on to, and some of the examples would be in terms of what we were talking about earlier, the white working class community, or let's say even Eastern European communities. One is obviously in terms of matching up the schools. The other is apprenticeships, where in the same locality there are some very successful businesses and professional institutions, but at the same time you got young people leaving schools but actually with no experience and nowhere to go, sadly. And so apprenticeships and mentoring programs, all of that can be extremely helpful in terms of interaction, breaking down barriers, but also equipping people with skill set. And I think post Covid-19, with the economic turn, that's going to be extremely important in terms of the job opportunities. And finally, moving on to imams, I think again, it's unless there is a kind of semi-organized, coordinated program, it leaves it to the local imam or faith leader to come up with their own ideas, build their own resource, and then deliver on that resource. Now, there may be some driven to do that. Others may not be as driven to do that. And then so working with, I guess, umbrella organizations to have some, and also the voluntary organizations that are already running and doing of their own accord, many of that work, is empowering them and enabling them to coordinate some of this. I think is possible. Otherwise, if we just leave it to the communities to do it, I think it may not be as effective. So in a way, I'm perhaps going to go back to the big society idea that we've had many years ago, but actually, there was some key factors that were missing.
Can I just butt in there? The big society was a whole branding exercise. It wasn't a new idea. Everybody on this call knows that there were already people in our community doing amazing works already. Would you not agree?
Just come in on something that, just if you don't mind, just something that's just triggered a couple of things that after Qari spoke there. One thing is for sure, if you work with the right local people, it's superb value for money. What happens, reason why money gets wasted sometimes is because it's given to people who are good at getting money, but may not be good at delivering stuff. What's really brilliant about people like us, and if I think about some of the stuff I've done with no money whatsoever, but time and commitment and people coming on board, you get loads done for very little money. The kind of stuff that Qari's talking about, where there is support and investment needed in terms of money, but not huge amounts, not millions and billions of pounds at all. As long as it gets into the right people with the right contacts, with the trust and the support and the credibility, then loads can get done. I think that's important. I just want to also mention, because it just came to me as Qari was talking, there's a whole art and science around volunteering. And what we saw happen, which was good and bad, was when the call was put out, who wants to volunteer? Remember sort of probably half a year ago when there was a call put out to say who wants to volunteer, actually too many people came forward. Why was it too many people came forward and weren't being able to be given and got actually quite disillusioned because they weren't given anything to do? It's because there is a whole science and art around volunteering. You need to have stuff ready, tangible, quick win, positive stuff that people can do that is actually making a difference, but that is easy and quick to do, and you have those enablers and people in place to do it. And I think that was a very good example of what we don't do. Don't just put out a call, even in a local area, and say, who wants to come forward? I saw this work locally here too. People wanted to come onto we split our town into 10, me and the other person I was working with, into 10 areas. So we super localized what is already a fairly small town here in Slough. And we had WhatsApp groups for each local part of that town, and people came forward. Now, they were regularly wanting actual things to do. So, if you give someone something to do, but the person giving that stuff to do needs to know what to give them to do, to then make them feel included and valued and part of the bigger picture and all of that. So I think there's just something to remember, that people need to understand that volunteering and enabling people to do things is kind of an art and a science of its own, which is very well researched and proven as to how to do it well and to get that really good feel-good factor from people out of it. And then the other example I wanted to give, but linked in something that Qari said, was I remember going to a food bank place where, bless them, elderly volunteers, let me say, like that, a group of them who'd been doing it for a very long time and were sitting in a room talking to each other, surrounded by food. I mean, this wasn't during last year, this was before this, but the principle for me is the same. And I remember taking some things that someone had given me and taking it there and looking around thinking, why are they sitting here with all of this food? This needs to be out to the people that in this area are struggling, where this particular place was located. Coupled with that, young Muslims in this case that I'm thinking of, who were desperate from the local mosque and the local sort of community centre to do some good stuff. And so for me, there's a match up here. How do we start to make this lovely food bank elderly group of people who've been doing it for years really realize that, look, how can we match up without making them feel that they have no job anymore, without making them feel that we're somehow trying to change what they've always done, but how do you bring in that young voluntary spirit? The guy who's messaging me saying, I want something to do, how do I match him up with this lovely group with this room full of food on a housing estate where people haven't got enough food. How do you link that all up? Make everyone feel that they're part of that. And it goes back to what Qari said, the institutions, the churches, the village halls, even mosques to an extent have space. How do you mean that you bring the people in and then make that happen? Because there's a lot of resource, either money or building or human resource, but matching it up, I think, is somehow how we can also bring some of these communities together so that everyone feels valued, but that we're bringing whatever our expertise and different things that we can to the table.
Thanks, Julie. Kaneez, can I come to you? Have you got some ideas about how we capitalise on those changes that we've seen over the last year? And what do you think local and national government should do?
I think that we really don't. I think what the most important thing here, from my own perspective and from what I've seen in West Yorkshire and across some of the experiences that I've had, I think what Julie was talking about with the mentors and things, really important. But if we don't deal with the structural inequalities within the school, university and college systems, doesn't matter how much we put in from outside of school, them children are still not going to get an education. If the stop and searches don't stop happening, if the disproportionate sentencing of the young people don't change, how is that trust going to build up? Again, I'm going to say, and I've said it all the way through this conversation, I feel as if government listened. I feel as if they wanted to listen. I feel as if they wanted to respond. I think that they had their open-mindedness, but then I also know that within our local structures, I don't know how much of that listening was wanted, needed, or and was gonna happen. How is that gap gonna be bridged? Because community just got on with it. Simple. They did get on with it. But within the areas that I worked in, most of the community that just got on with it, they're from some of the most deprived areas that don't have the money, don't have the resourcing, and actually need the resourcing, need that social mobility, so that they can take their families and themselves out of the poverty that they're in. I think people were giving from themselves when they didn't have anything to give. And I don't know how that's going to get changed, but I think there's got to be a lot of thinking from local authorities. LAs are so stuck in their structures and their systems. And so I'm part of the West Yorkshire Health Partnership. I'm one of the founding members from the VCS, and West Yorkshire Health Partnerships are looking at the inequalities, and they are trying. But there's a system-led approach that whole health partnership is built on. Us as community, we're not system-led. We're about how do we affect change within communities, and that doesn't mean that the health partnership doesn't save lives and doesn't have those intentions. It's just they are a machine. How do we bring those two together? And that's one of the emails I'll be sending in the next couple of days anyway. But there's something that we've got to look at, how those systems, this well-oiled machine that has been running for so many years, how is that going to carry on embracing that they've tried to engage? So I'm not saying that all LAs haven't tried to engage. Of course they have. They've tried to embrace, they've tried to engage. But how do we carry on doing that, making mistakes along the way? And that's okay, making those mistakes along the way. But how do we step up, and how do we all come in the middle? And that is through communication, that is through talking, that is through listening exercises. And at Neighbours, we do have Real People on His Talk. Real People on His Talk is bringing the white British communities together and putting them in a room with the asylum seekers and refugees, and are having those conversations. But then when we're taking them to LAs, and we don't ask LAs to change their structures or their design or anything else, we just say, come and listen, have a listen. But do they have the capacity to make those changes that are needed? And they're very, very, very real, challenging circumstances on the ground. Like one of the examples that one of the asylum seekers gave was that they live in a block of flats in Leeds, and they were walking past. He goes, I was walking past, I thought it was a mattress that was thrown out of the window from the height of the flats to the ground. It wasn't, it was somebody who jumped out. The level of suicide that's going to be coming up, or has been, I don't even want to see the statistics actually for suicide in this last year and ongoing going forward as well. And that is there is going to be a desperate need for us all to work together, but we need to meet in the middle somewhere, both lots, the LAs, the authorities, the systems, the structural, and that honest conversation about the inequalities. If that honest conversation isn't had, change isn't going to happen, mistrust isn't going to build. And I think Qari said it earlier, didn't you? You said, and I felt it all the way through this year, there's been like a decade of neglect, and how are we trying to unstick this? How can we change this mentality? We can't do it overnight. It's got to be a process that we're doing, and we're consistently doing it together for the next decade, and then we'll see if there is progress. But are we going to be able to do that consistently together for the next decade? Is that listening still going to happen? I think that's my perspective.
I have no doubt that the 4 vocal voices that we've got here are certainly going to make themselves heard. So I have no doubt that you will still continue the conversation. So just to come to my last question, if I may, because we're kind of running out of time now. I would just like to ask you, and we've already met with a number of business organisations and business volunteer facilitation organisations, for want of a better phrase, about business engagement, business work in the community, and how that interacts with community groups, faith groups, etc. I just wonder if you could just each give me a couple of minutes to explain how local businesses, national businesses, engaged with you in your respective communities during the pandemic, and how we could further potentially capitalise on that. So if I can start with you, Qari.
Sorry, I think the business community engaged really well during the pandemic in terms of food parcels, and it's all the way from supermarkets to the local grocers. And we've got example in Leeds of All Hallows Church, where in a way the space is provided by a church. The handouts are given by local businesses as well as individuals, and then the communities that are served are people of all backgrounds, and that really makes it an inspiring example, I think. But people do not necessarily just want give out handouts in terms of food. The people want to see the businesses contributing more to their communities. And obviously the businesses are going to have their own limitations, but perhaps some things that we can think about is apprenticeships or work experiences, contributing time as well as energies to perhaps working with the local nurseries, local parks, so that there is a real sense that the businesses are embedded in that particular community. That's one thing I think that's currently lacking, and perhaps something that will, if it happened, it will shine a good light on our communities.
Thank you, Qari. Lazzaro?
Yes, definitely. Businesses are part of the local community, and local people really value their local businesses. And I think thinking about moment of bringing those different parts of the community together, like local fairs or opportunity for people to be involved with apprenticeship or other moment of connection between the businesses and the local people are very important. But if I may, can I go back to one of the points that Julie mentioned earlier about mutual aid? Because I was a founder of my mutual aid in my area, and indeed the response has been overwhelming. At the same time, if we move forward to a model where local champion and volunteers are part of the response, I think we also should be careful about providing people the right training and the right safeguarding and things, because I've seen in my mutual aid group something that really made me cringe. Personal details forward to 500, 600 people. I saw a young lady sent to help a homeless with mental health problem, and she ended up attacked. So we need to build the skills and the training for people to be able to fulfill those roles that they're happy to do, but at the same time, without any bureaucratizing or anything, but be aware that they need to be carried out in a proper way.
Thank you, Lazzaro. That's a really important point about you know, the proper training, supervision and control of data and information and protection of those people that are coming forward. Kaneez, can I come to you just to comment on business engagement as well in your projects locally?
I think that business engagement in all the areas that we worked in was brilliant, was really, really good, especially where it come to the food work, I mean, they stepped up, they stepped in, and they did what they needed to do. Within normal times as well, I know that solicitors firms, law firms do go into schools and do some of the, like the extra tutoring there, the reading, maybe that could be developed into a more nationwide type of program that would do really well. Again, I think with businesses, their staff that are going to be coming back out of lockdown the mental health around there, are they going to have counselling services in place? Because I know some young people that have gone back to school and they're having panic attacks on the buses because they're not used to being in the crowds and they're wanting that social distancing. But actually, when you're getting on a bus with 30, 40 other children, you're not going to have that social distancing there in real time. So how much of that support are they going to provide their staff, the young people, the mental health crisis that we've got coming up and is speeding up to us so fast within the next few years. So our business is going to have that support in place as part and parcel of their package, of their healthcare package to their workers, or aren't they, their employees? So that's really something that I think needs to be considered too.
Thank you, Kaneez. And finally, Julie, can I come to you regarding business engagement?
Yeah, I mean, again, as others have said, I saw some great examples of businesses giving out things and food being sort of collected from one place and taken to another and then given out to families and things. I think that was quite incredible the way a lot of that happened. Given the difficulties of social distancing and all of that, it was amazing how it still happened. I think it's almost like it was a short-term thing. And I think for me, it's got to be about thinking through in a more strategic way. How do you make use of, for example, the CSR responsibility that companies have? How do we do that in a way that's much more effective? It goes back to what I said earlier. We need to understand that there's a way of doing volunteering. You can do a day where a whole load of employees go out and paint or something, but like what else, you know, can't we go a bit deeper?
Julie, you've gone on to mute.
Sorry. No, can it not be a bit more embedded in what's needed? I've had local conversations here, for example, with people in the business communities. We've got I think the biggest trading estate in Europe here, and of course a lot of those companies are tech companies earning lots of money, doing really well, in an area where there are some kids that are really struggling at school. For example, we've had some stabbings and murders of young men here that have been, because of knife crime. And I even just dipped my toe in the water a bit to try and think, how can the business community do more about some of that stuff, for example? And I saw a nervousness and an unease about getting involved in what I would consider to be real stuff, real work that can really make a difference if you match up properly. Yeah. Business mentors or businesses that can create opportunities for employees to do what I would consider to be really proper, valuable, needed volunteering, as opposed to just getting them to go and paint a fence, which is great, but actually how do we make it a bit more meaningful? And I think there's a lot more that can be done there. It needs smart, creative, strategic thinking, but again, with some good people around the table, teachers or head teachers, businesses, community people, faith group. I know that in some areas that's working, in other areas it's totally not happening, that conversation. And I think that is something really kind of waiting to happen.
Thanks, Julie. Can I thank you all for your really powerful testimonies, which have been incredibly helpful to us in the preparation of this report. You've all clearly been doing incredible works in your respective communities, and if you're ever considering relocating, can I encourage you to consider Darlington? The Chancellor has already relocated half of the Treasury to my town, so you'd be very welcome too. So thank you very much indeed. I am grateful to you, and I know that the team at British Future are as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.